to the lives of New Zealanders. Kia ora tātou.
Chair.
Honourable Chester Borrows.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I rise to just address the SOPs that have been brought forward by the members so far. And I think it's important at the outset to speak to a number of ancillary points that were raised in the course of this debate. And the first one, which was raised by the member David Clark, talked about conscience votes. And what Mr Clark doesn't have the opportunity to draw on was the discussions that occurred within the Select Committee process in the last term of government. And it's important to note that in the whole course of those discussions, it was accepted by people from across the parties represented there that there would probably be party votes on everything except age. That was very clearly where the Select Committee members went to with the knowledge of their parties, their wider parties. There was no suggestion that there was going to be conscience votes on anything other than the age question, and that is the recommendation of the Law Commission's report. This is the same Law Commission's report that this is the same Law Commission point that every spokesman from the opposition draws out and holds up as to be the absolute gospel in respect of alcohol debate in this country, and yet they have moved away from a sentinel part of that report, and that report was that parties nailed their colours to the mast and voted as parties in respect of these matters. Now, another point that the Honourable Leanne Dalzell raises consistently is what happened to her bill. The bill that she introduced when she was part of the last Labor government prior to the 2008 election. And it's important to note this point. Her bill was introduced to the House on the 8th of August 2008. The House rose on the 23rd of September 2008 for an election. There were only 11 sitting days between the August the 8th and the 23rd of September. Now, what happened after that? Well, it went on to Select Committee, and what happened after that was the incoming National Government, under the Minister of Justice, the then Honourable, I suppose he's still the Honourable Simon Howard, the then Minister of Justice, replaced the bill that we hear about from the Honourable Leanne Dalzell with his own bill. That is not unusual. In fact, it certainly happened under the Labor government, which replaced bills that the National Government, the then National Government, introduced prior to the 1999 election and rewrote them themselves. And I cite the victims legislation. Which the Honourable Phil Goff, as was his right, replaced the Honourable Tony Ryall's bill in respect of victims. So I just lay out for those people who are interested, those people at home who are interested, and those members who are newer to the House, that this is the way it is done, and it's done by governments of both colour, like it or not. Now, another point that is interesting that was made by David Clark, and that was around culture. Whether we want to accept it or not, we've got a horrible culture of binge drinking in this country. And it sticks to us like it does to the Aussies, like it does to the North Americans, and like it does to the Poms. But to try and overlay, then, another European culture's approach to alcohol, such as the Germans, on top of the new, and expect, for instance, that would be picked up, would be exactly the same mistake that this Parliament made in the 90s when it decided we were all going to start drinking like the French, like a friend of Mr Hague's over there mentioned. And I have some personal experience of this too, as I've shared our house for the last year with my daughter-in-law, who's a Slovakian, who for some reason when she's making a coffee in the morning would put a slug of alcohol in it, much to my astonishment. That was the way they did it. At the same time, 10 o'clock in the morning, she might decide, does anyone else want a beer? Well, it wasn't even lunchtime. It was abhorrent to be drinking beer before lunchtime unless you just cut up a cord of wood, as I'm sure the chair would attest to. In any event, that is part of the culture. Having said that, I would offer her a glass of wine at night. She would sit on it for 3 hours. It happens to be the culture of the way some countries drink. So to try and overlay those cultures into our culture is something that is just totally different and we can't do in this country. I think the point in respect, Chair, sorry, to anticipate the word of command, Mr. Chair.
Honourable Chester-Borrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We must remember in considering these SOPs that the biggest encourager in respect of drinking alcohol is personal role modelling that we do within our own homes and in our own environments, and we shouldn't try and walk away from that responsibility. In respect of SOP 91 introduced by Mr Lees Galloway, which talks about banning billboards and posters advertising within 300 metres of certain locations, creating a new watershed for alcohol advertising, banning alcohol advertising in cinemas, etc. It's important to note that the government has already agreed to establish an expert forum to consider further restrictions on alcohol advertising and sponsorship. And whereas we noted during the course of the Select Committee debates on both bills that it considered in the last term of government that there was a significant push against alcohol advertising and alcohol sponsorship, it's also important to recognise that the evidence that we were confronted with was also countered by others as well. And I believe that it's an important thing for us to establish our own forum to report back initially within 12 months to have a look at how alcohol alcohol advertising influences the way that people drink and their purchase behaviours in this country rather than overseas. Because what we know, for instance, within this country, the rapid take-up of technology is that although there may still be advertising on our television screens at regular and frequent intervals after certain times within this country, people are watching less and less advertising as they have the ability to screen past it. In respect of SOP 115 from Dr David Clark, the government will not support this SOP because, as mentioned, the government is setting up its own expert forum on alcohol advertising and sponsorship, and it will consider whether further restrictions are needed to reduce our alcohol-related harm. And the forum will be established after the bill's pass and will report back to the Minister of Health within a year. In respect of SOP 81 from Te Ururoa Flavel, the government doesn't recommend supporting this proposal because there's little research about the effectiveness of these restrictions at reducing alcohol-related harm. Most of us would have significant... Most of it... Give him a smack. Most of us would agree that the advertising we see in respect of alcohol is ludicrous. We wonder how it can possibly be effective. But the point that he made quite well in his speech was that the alcohol companies wouldn't be spending $150 million a year if it wasn't having making some difference. However, they tend to do that as they continuously make the point that they are trying to establish a brand as opposed to starting people drinking. Well, none of us are too sucked in by that. However, I return to the fact that this government wants to be able to have a look at its own research and create its own response to that. It would also have, the Members' Bill would also have a significant consequence for many clubs and organisations that would lose income, and the responsibility for making transitional funding would be very expensive to a government at a time when there is not a lot of money about. I don't know if the member interjecting would even concede that, bearing in mind a lot of that money is going to parts of her electorate. These restrictions would be premature ahead of recommendations from the expert forum, and that will be established after the passing of this bill.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.